10 most powerful gorillas in history. When you look across the landscape of the world, there are many large apes that you don't want to mess with. Most of all is the gorilla. The gorilla is the world's largest ape. These majestic creatures are huge, they're powerful, they're muscular. Quite frankly, they are one of the last animals you want to upset. But if we are talking about the biggest apes in the world, then let's kick it up a notch. Let's talk about the biggest of the biggest and the most powerful. Who were the biggest and most powerful gorillas that ever graced this planet? And is there such a thing as any of them getting too big? Titus. Meet Titus, born August 24, 1974. He was observed by researchers almost his entire life and was the subject of the documentary Titus, the Gorilla King. Titus lived with his troop in Rwanda in a Volcanoes National Park. When he was 4 years old, another gorilla joined their group. The researchers asked what his name was. No one knew. Someone said, "Beats me," so his name became Beats Me. As Titus and Beats Me grew up, Beats Me became the leader as he was the dominant male. Eventually, Titus outgrew him and forced him out of his spot as leader of the troop. Titus took over. Titus became king. The king that weighed over 400 pounds. No other gorilla in the area compared to Titus. And Beats Me remained in the troop, but became Titus's subordinate. Titus lived until he was 35, ruling his troop for more than half of his life, and he sired more children than any other gorilla on record. In 2004, he controlled the largest gorilla troop in the world. He was a king that left his legacy on the planet. Can't be. One of the most famous human names when it comes to gorilla is Diane Fossey. She observed many different gorillas in her time as a researcher. One of these gorillas was one that she named Can't Be. Fossey actually first saw Can't Be when he was born in 1978. Can't Be grew up, and Fossey observed him for so much of his life, and he eventually became the leader of a group. This was the historic Pablo group, and Can't Be led this group for over 21 years. He lived to be 39 years old, so he was the leader of this group for over half of his life. Can't Be sired many children, and the size of his group grew and grew. His dominance over the group was remarkable. No matter if he was ever challenged, no one could take the group from Can't Be. He is regarded as the most successful male mountain gorilla ever tracked due to the size of his group and the length of his dominance. Researchers with Fossey that followed Can't Be remarked how he was the most powerful and confident of all the silverback leaders that they ever witnessed. The group knew to stay in line around Can't Be. Literally, when it was time to follow him, they actually formed long lines behind him. His dominance over them was remarkable. Effie. Sometimes power comes in a different form. Now we know that the male gorillas will be the leaders of the groups and they get to larger sizes. But there will also be a dominant female in each gorilla group. And the same Pablo group that Can't Be ruled for so many years, well, there was a dominant female in it for many years known as Effie. Effie was one of a kind. She actually started the family group that's been the most productive group in the entirety of the Virunga Mountains. Her power was showcased not just in her physical dominance over the other females, but in her legacy. Effie has over 100 descendants, making sure she left her stamp on the world. Although Diane Fossey is gone, there is still the Fossey Fund, and they still monitor gorilla groups in the wild. Of the 9 gorilla groups that the Fossey Fund monitors, 5 of them are led by an Effie family member. So just like Fossey, even though Effie is gone, she's left her mark on this world. She exerted power and dominance over the Pablo group when she was alive, and she taught her descendants well, because they all seem to lead the remaining groups today. Pablo. You might be wondering about this Pablo group that we keep talking about, and that name, Pablo. Where did it come from? Well, it came from none other than Pablo the gorilla. When Diane Fossey was observing this particular group of gorillas, she just called it Group 5. Pablo was born in 1974, and Fossey observed him through much of his childhood. He was a carefree young gorilla and enjoyed playtime. But when he grew, when he matured, he took on the responsibility of adulthood seriously. Pablo then formed his own group, you guessed it, the Pablo group. And we spoke of the legacy of Count B and of Effie, but both of them were part of the Pablo group. This group never would have existed if it weren't for Pablo. He started the group and he led it. It is the most famous guerrilla group that has ever been documented, and it is still present today. That is a long-standing group, and its long run is impressive. Although Count B took over the Pablo group even while Pablo was still around, he was the originator, and he was not to be trifled with back in his day. Isabukuru. This Pablo group is tremendous. It just keeps giving us legend after legend. Although the legend of the gorilla they named Isabukuru started more so in the shadows of the Pablo group. You see, Isabukuru was the brother of the legendary Count B. Isabukuru was quite the large gorilla and rivaled even the size of Count B, but he never took over the Pablo group. However, he did exert his power in other ways, in sneaky ways. Even when Isabukuru was young, his size made him popular with the ladies in the group. Now, in a gorilla group, usually it is just the leader that has exclusive breeding rights to the females. So that meant only Count B should have been able to breed with the females. That did not stop Isabukuru, who still mated with the females behind his brother's back. He sired his first offspring while still in the Pablo group and while still a subordinate to his own brother. At the age of 14, Isabukuru wound up leaving the group and starting his own group, and he stole away several of the females with him when he did this. Stealing women from his own brother's group, if you want to talk about power, that is a power move right there. The heaviest. Now, male gorillas in captivity can become quite overweight, probably due to all the extra food their caretakers give them and the limited exercise they get. Some gorillas in captivity can exceed 600 pounds. But in the wild, they rarely reach those numbers. However, there was a gorilla once found in Ambam, Cameroon. He was a beast. Unfortunately, poachers wanted the male silverback gorilla, and so they shot him. When they finally managed to size him up afterwards, they were astonished. He was 6 feet tall, which was already a large height for a gorilla. However, that wasn't the most impressive part. When they weighed this silverback gorilla from Cameroon, he clocked in at 580 pounds. That is the heaviest recorded gorilla from the wild. That is unrivaled weight right there. The tallest. If you were impressed by the heaviest gorilla ever caught in the wild, then just get ready for this next one. He may not have broken a scale when he stepped foot on it like our last gorilla, but this one impressed everyone in a different way. This was a long time ago, all the way back in May of 1938. That's right, we have to go back close to 100 years ago to find the tallest gorilla ever recorded. We head to Bongo in northern Kivu. A male gorilla was found and his sheer size was jaw-dropping. He stood 6 feet 6 inches tall. Again, the tallest recorded gorilla ever. And it wasn't just his height that was impressive. His arm span was 8 feet and 10 inches long. To see this behemoth standing tall and with his arms out would be a spectacle. And we had to go back so many years just to learn about this record breaker. He also weighed 483 pounds. Unfortunately, this is another nameless gorilla who was killed by poachers. However, the legend of the tallest gorilla ever lives on, the beast from Bongo. Guy. Okay, we told you about the heaviest gorilla ever in the wild. We told you about the tallest gorilla ever in the wild. Get ready for another record breaker. This is the gorilla with the longest arm span that's ever been recorded. They called him Guy the gorilla. The dimensions of Guy are quite interesting when you compare them to these other gorillas. Guy was 5 feet and 4 inches tall, so he was definitely shorter than both the last two gorillas, and by a noticeable amount. However, he weighed 520 pounds. So he weighed more than our tallest gorilla, the one that was 1 foot and 2 inches taller than him. However, he still didn't weigh as much as the heaviest gorilla ever. So Guy was kind of a short and squat fellow. But listen to this, his arm length was 9 feet. The gorilla that was the tallest ever, his arm span was 2 inches shorter than that. So imagine, Guy was over a foot shorter but with longer arms. Guy also had an upper arm circumference of 23.5 inches. His thighs were 28 inches, and his neck was 36 inches. Guy was a sturdy guy. No one was knocking this gorilla down. One last interesting tidbit about Guy: when the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey was in pre-production, the actor Dan Richter was set to play the lead ape man in the now famous scene from the movie. To prepare for his role, he studied Guy intently, doing his best to mimic his movements and mannerisms to bring the most authenticity to the role. Leave it to Guy to help a guy play a convincing ape man in a movie. Phil. We told you about the heaviest gorilla in the wild, but what about the heaviest ever? Hands down, it was Phil the gorilla. He arrived at the St. Louis Zoo in 1941. He was a toddler, just 25 pounds, but he lived at the zoo for the next 17 years, and Phil grew and grew and grew, until Phil reached a whopping 776 pounds. Clearly, he was able to eat too much, and zoogoers were able to give him all sorts of food that were not healthy for him. Eventually, Phil was unhappy with life in the St. Louis Zoo, and maybe in an attempt to cut down some weight, he began fasting. But this led to Phil's death in 1958. He lived at the zoo for just under 2 decades, but for anyone who traveled to St. Louis and saw Phil, they can say they saw the heaviest gorilla that ever lived. Samson. If we haven't learned this lesson yet, we're about to learn it with Samson. Samson was another gorilla that was captured and put in a zoo, specifically the Washington Park Zoo in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Samson was a male silverback western lowland gorilla, and the people in the zoo put him alone in a grass enclosure. Samson was enormous. He weighed 652 pounds at his peak, but this was not just show weight. This was not just weight put on by eating all day at the zoo. Samson was incredibly strong, and he was not happy with his surroundings, and perhaps with the fact that he was left alone in his enclosure. Samson grew more and more frustrated with his enclosure and would repeatedly charge and slam into the windows. These were the windows that were reinforced and meant to contain even a gorilla. Well, Samson broke those windows 4 different times. His power was unmatched, and the zoo had to repeatedly replace the windows due to his outbursts. Samson isn't the only one. All gorillas are huge and powerful animals, whether we are talking about the strongest ones or not. They are not to be messed with. They are not to be captured. They are not to be left alone. And God forbid you ever come across one of these 10 gorillas, or the next 10 biggest or strongest gorillas, because you will not stand a chance against them.